Hi, it's Rabbi Jeremy from Mahar. As a lot of Maharniks know, I've been dealing with some injuries, and so it's a little bit difficult for me to consistently do the kinds of Kabbalat Shabbat services that we're accustomed to. And so we've had a little bit of a hiatus during the summer. I'm still working on recovering, but this is an important Shabbat because it's Labor Day weekend. And so let's talk a little bit about Labor Day weekend, about this particular Shabbat, about the year that we're going to end soon. So, about Labor Day, there are important humanistic Jewish values that tie into Labor Day, dealing with human dignity and the ability to provide and care for your family. And one of the organizations that Mahar has worked with, Jews United for Justice, has a program every year called Labor on the Bima. The idea being that rabbis and cantors and Jewish leaders who are involved with the life of various Jewish congregations bring up for their congregations issues related to labor and worker rights that feel important at the time, or are campaigns that JUFJ, Jews United for Justice, is working on with other organizations. And this year we don't actually have a big ask. What we have instead is a chance to celebrate that Maryland and DC have actually expanded through their legislative processes, have actually expanded the rights available to workers, specifically around paid medical leave and around paid family leave, to be able to take time off to care for family members while also still continuing to receive a paycheck. Right? We know that the Federal Family Medical Leave Act really says, okay, you'll be able to keep your job and come back to it, and you can have a bunch of weeks unpaid. These family medical leave laws in Maryland and in DC create another kind of paid leave and ensure that workers have at least some amount of time to care for ailing family members or to care for themselves when they're sick. And this is a big deal. So JUFJ is really celebrating that this has happened in both Maryland and DC, and is reminding us as well that executive branch agencies and the legislature will have to continue to make sure that these laws are followed. And so there's a little bit of a need to kind of keep an eye out. But this year, we get to celebrate a little bit more dignity for workers, which is a good thing to talk about on Labor Day. So we're in the book of Deuteronomy in the traditional Torah reading cycle, which is not, we don't organize everything at Mahar around the traditional Torah reading cycle, but it's nice to look at it from time to time. And the book of Deuteronomy in particular is interesting because while it kind of claims to be Moses' valedictory speech, which is a little bit hard to square up with the idea that the earliest we know about a book like this is around 600 BCE, and Moses would have been dead for 700 years. We don't want to worry too much about the historicity here, because there are these universal Jewish and universal human concerns that are present in the book of Deuteronomy that are worth talking about. Because the book of Deuteronomy is in large part concerned with, what does it mean to have a just society? We don't always agree with its answers, but the question is an important one. And where we are in the Torah reading cycle in the book of Deuteronomy is we're almost really in the middle of the book, and we get to a section called, right now, Parshat Shoftim. Shoftim, a Hebrew word that means judges. So this is the section of the book that's going to talk about how judges should behave. But it's also going to talk about how Israelite government would be structured. And Israelite society is the predecessor to Jewish society and Jewish culture. So it's worth taking a look at that, because this is our past in a way. And so what the book of Deuteronomy says is you're going to have judges, and judges need to be, it doesn't use the word impartial because that's not a Hebrew word, but instead it talks about judges not deferring to people because of wealth. And that means not deferring to people because they're wealthy, and also not deferring to people because they're poor, right? So it's this kind of even-handed sense of justice, which is one that at least seems to be the way the US legal system maybe ideally would function. So we have this discussion of judges, and we have a discussion of the role of priests. Israelite society is not one that does separation of religion and government. Priests who are involved with running the temple are also involved in judging cases and making decisions. And so secular government is not a thing 2,700 years ago. But priests are involved in running the government. And then we get to this section that is difficult to interpret or difficult to fully understand. And it's talking about having a king. We know, right, that Israelite society had kings. King Saul and King David and King Solomon and King Josiah and King Hezekiah, right? We know that the Israelites had kings. So it might be surprising to discover that the book of Deuteronomy is actually very ambivalent about there being kings. And so what the book of Deuteronomy actually says at this point, this is the end of chapter 17 in Deuteronomy, it says, when you decide to have a king, like the other nations, you shall have a king. And it leaves off the like the other nations part. So what does that mean? Well, the king doesn't seem to have a role to do much other than he seems to be required to write, maybe it's the book of Deuteronomy, maybe it's the Torah, it's not real clear, has to have a copy of it that he writes and that he keeps with him and take instruction on it from the priests. So again, we don't have secular society here. That's his job. That's the commandment that applies to the king. Your job is to do X. And the king is also told, don't do Y. And the don't do's are things that we think we would want people in government not to do. Don't use your position to go and accumulate wives, right? This is a society that does polygamy, right? We don't want you to go and accumulate wives. We don't want you to go and accumulate horses, because horses pull chariots and chariots fight wars. So this is a don't go out to war all the time kind of a thing. Don't go looking for more money. Don't go back to Egypt. But there's a number of things that kings are just not supposed to do. We don't have a great sense for what kings are supposed to do. But we see that the primary concern is keeping the king somewhat on the straight and narrow, which we might think seems kind of odd, but if you've ever read the US Constitution, you've probably noticed that there's not a whole lot that says what the president does, because that role, the executive role, tends to grow. And so the job is to keep it small, not to enable it. And so we have this discussion about the king, but the question becomes, do you need a king? And so medieval Jewish commentators start to debate this. And they eventually some of them decide that the Torah is saying you have to have a king. And some of them say the Torah is saying if you want to have a king, you don't have to, but if you want to, here are the rules. There is a medieval commentator, Abravanel. He's really the last of the major medieval commentators. Isaac Abravanel is unique among biblical commentators because he's actually worked for Ferdinand and Isabella. That's what he did. He was their financier and advisor. And he worked for them all the way up until 1492 when the Jews were expelled. And he actually negotiated a delay in the expulsion. And after he works for them, he leaves, he goes to Portugal, he works for the King of Portugal until Portugal expels its Jews in 1497, at which point he then has to move to Italy. And he's bankrupted and rebuilds several times in his life. But he has direct experience with government, and he has direct experience with kings. And Abravanel, reading this section of Deuteronomy and writing his commentary, and he says, look, I've surveyed everything. I've read all the Greek philosophers. I've read all the Jewish sages. I've read all the history books. I don't know how you read all the history books, but I've read all the history. Nobody needs a king. There are better forms of government. There are less corrupt forms of government. Nobody needs a king, because kings are prone to doing bad things. And yet this is the book of Deuteronomy that is expressing ambivalence about too much power in one person's hands. At the same time, the book of Deuteronomy is the book that gives us phrases like tzedek, tzedek tirdof, righteousness, righteousness shall you pursue. The book of Deuteronomy is also the book that gives us the idea of Shemitah, of release. So the Shemitah year, sometimes we call it a sabbatical year, is the idea that every 7 years, debts are wiped out, people who are serving as indentured servants are to be released, right? This idea that there are poor people in society, and sometimes what poor people need is to kind of have everything reset, and for their rights to be restored, and for land to go back to where it was, and for workers who are going to be released from indenture to not only just be dumped on the street, but to have some basic means of sustaining themselves. So we have this ambivalence about government. We have this idea that government's supposed to be impartial somehow. We have this idea that having poor people is not what we're supposed to have in society. In a very closely numbered set of verses, Deuteronomy says there should be no poor among you. But poor people will be among you, and here's what you do about them. And it's Labor Day weekend, and we're in the end of the Shemitah year, this year of release. And so it's worth stopping this Labor Day weekend and thinking about, what does it mean to release debts? What are the implications for it? Because we're only 2 weeks out from President Biden saying, okay, it's time to forgive some amount of student debt, and issuing instructions on what that should look like. So we have a president who has decided to release some debts. We've had uneven encounters with executive branch folks over the last, 50 years. We've had some better presidents and some not so good presidents when it comes to the idea of the imperial presidency. And so we have this kind of mixed bag of presidents. We have this kind of, what does it mean to release so much student debt issue? What does it mean to release debt in general? What does it mean to treat workers well? And we're in Labor Day weekend. And so I just encourage you to take some time this Labor Day weekend to think through some of these things and think about where you are, and to think about what you think the next thing should be that happens with this, and what you can do to make the next thing happen. Because at the end of the day, within humanistic Judaism, human dignity is essential, and also taking steps to see the world you want to have, that's also essential. So I hope I'll see more of you in person or online as time goes on. September 18th is our return to Jewish Cultural School programming for our kids and to adult education for adult members of our community. And then not too long after that, we have the high holidays, so we can think about all kinds of other issues related to justice and what an ideal society might look like and how we might get there. So I hope that you got something out of this, some food for thought this weekend. I hope that you have a good Labor Day weekend, and one that's maybe a little bit thoughtful. Shabbat Shalom.